Thank you everyone for staying on with us as we get ready for this next session on national efforts in preservation and justice, going beyond diversity and inclusion. So I want to thank and welcome our moderator for this session, Dennis Arguelles, who is with the National Parks Conservation Association, Senior Program Manager. Is that your latest title? So Dennis and I actually go way back. And so I'm really pleased to have Dennis moderate this session. So hand it off to you.
Thank you, Michelle. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you're at. As Michelle mentioned, my name is Dennis Arguelles. I work for the National Parks Conservation Association. And it's really my privilege and pleasure this morning or today to moderate our panel on national efforts in preservation justice, going beyond diversity and inclusion. I think we have a lot of speakers that are really dynamic and interesting, and we're up for a real interesting conversation. Just briefly, NPCA, my organization, our interest in this panel, in this conference, stems from our belief that all American stories need to be told through our national park system. And though we were founded to protect our national park system, we believe that in order for it to be sustainable in the long term, all Americans need to feel invested and have ownership in that system. But not only do we believe that these stories need to be told, particularly stories of underrepresented communities for strategic reasons, we just believe it's a moral imperative, and it's about being on the right side of history. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is introduce the speakers in the order that they'll be presenting today. They'll be speaking each for, I believe, about 15 minutes, and then we'll have time for Q&A right afterwards. So this afternoon, we'll get started with Michelle Magalong. Michelle is a presidential postdoctoral fellow at the School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation at University of Maryland. She brings to this role her extensive professional and research experience in community development, historic preservation, and public health in underserved communities. Her doctorate in urban planning at UCLA focused on the process and development of the National Park Service's Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Initiative and Theme Study. And Michelle is also currently the president of Asian and Pacific Islanders in Historic Preservation. Following her, we have Sarah Zenaida Gould. Sarah is the interim executive director of the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute. She was the founding director of Museo del West Side, a project of the Esperanza Peace and Justice Center in San Antonio, Texas. Sarah is also a lecturer and adjunct Jeffrey, an independent historian and preservation consultant who works with historic preservation organizations, historic sites, nonprofit organizations, and academic institutions on preserving issues related to diversity and historic site interpretation. He was the first director for diversity at the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and he currently serves as the board chair of the Rainbow Heritage Network, a national organization that seeks to preserve historic sites related to the history of the LGBT community. And among his publications in the National Park Service's LGBTQ Heritage Theme Study entitled Where We Could Be Ourselves, African American LGBTQ Historic Places and Why They Matter. So as you can see, we have a lot of great speakers. I think all of them on the cutting edge of not just preserving important stories that need to be told through historic preservation, but making sure that they're a part of our national dialogue and national consciousness. So to get us started, Michelle, please take it away.
Thanks, Dennis. So hopefully, I'm hearing weird feedback. Is everything okay? All right. Sorry.
Michelle, it's better now. I think Dennis just had to mute, so you're good.
Okay, great, thank you. So, all right. So thanks again, Dennis. And so I am presenting on from diversity and inclusion to justice and equity, elevating Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in historic preservation. So oftentimes when I mentioned at my welcome remarks, when we think of places that have these designations, we rarely ever see places like this. The Little Tokyo Historic District, which is located in downtown Los Angeles. This is actually a really hard marker to find even when you're in Little Tokyo, because it's tucked away in an alleyway, and many people don't often see it. But little do they know how much time and effort and leadership it had taken to get to that point, to get that plaque. And then there's places like the Harada House in Riverside, California, which before I was here in Washington, D.C., I was living in the Inland Empire, working at UC Riverside. And the Harada House I would pass on my way to work every morning. But little did people know that an important place like this existed in Riverside. They may know the mission inn, but they don't really know about Harada House. And so this speaks to, there are places all over the country that are often not seen or visited when it comes to national landmarks, national historic landmarks on the National Register and monuments. So like Angel Island in San Francisco, Iolani Palace in Honolulu, Hawaii, Manzanar in near Independence, California, and the Harada House, again, in Riverside, are just a few of the places that are associated with Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders that are actually listed as National Historic Landmarks and on the National Register. But then again, only less than 1%, again, less than 1% of the listings on the National Register is associated with Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And we often think about you know, why is that the case? And often the history of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders throughout the United States and its territories is often not really thought about. And really, it's this image of Chinatown is what people think Asian American history and even Pacific Islander history, you know, misconstrued into that thinking. While Chinatowns are important places and have a long, rich history, it doesn't encompass all of who we are, even for Chinese Americans. This was not just the place that they existed, but as you know, the National Park Service acknowledged that there were Asian Americans, like this Chinese American soldier that fought in the Civil War. So we are often seen as these perpetual foreigners. We just arrived fresh off the boat, you know, but not to say that we've been here serving the country during the Civil War, building the railroad. But we also deal with a history of exclusion, discrimination, and disfranchisement, which often leads to not only our expulsion here as seen in, you know, after Chinese Exclusion Acts of 1882, that we were, you know, Chinese Americans alone were brought here as labor and then told to leave, or not told, but enforced in their departure or killed violently. But what is often thought of is the erasure of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. Here, this is the historic photo of Golden Spike, the last spike to connect the east and the west of the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. This is located in Utah. And if you look here, you don't see any of the Chinese American laborers that had played a pivotal part and very dangerously, you know, risked their lives to help contribute to the building of the railroad. But how do we look at shifting and reclaiming the narrative to include Asian and Pacific Islander Americans? This photo was taken recently in the recent years by Chinese American photographer Corky Lee, and with the descendants of Chinese Americans that were part of this, you know, huge feat of building the Transcontinental Railroad. If you actually look up PBS Asian Americans, the docu-series that aired last year, you will actually get to see and hear the stories of some of these individuals in this moment and how this photo is actually captured. So it really begs to ask, how do we shift and reclaim narratives of places? And that how can we have lasting impact? And so here, Golden Spike National Historic Site in Utah, if you go to their website through the National Park Service, you will now see that there is a section devoted to the recognition of Chinese American contributions to this site. This is new. This was probably in the last 10 years that this kind of mention was included. And furthermore, how do we, you've probably heard some folks refer to the National Park Service theme studies, and you'll hear a whole session devoted to it tomorrow. But really, how do we go from being in the margins to recentering that? Where here you see this photo of a book, that's the Asian American Pacific Islander National Historic Landmarks theme study, which was completed in 2018. But how can we start to shift and contribute more so in the literature, in historic preservation? And the NHL, this theme study in 2018 actually paved the way, playing around with the term, paving a path forward, really to what now has become subsequent theme studies, context statements, and the like throughout not only the West Coast, but now even here on the East Coast in Boston. We have those pending here in Washington, D.C. and in Maryland. And really, how do we reshift that? And for us at API HIP, and I'm going to talk about how all of this really, this movement that's happened in the last 10 years really has been something that I've been documenting. As mentioned, I'm the president of Asian and Pacific Islander Americans in Historic Preservation. And so parts of my presentation today are from articles that I've written in 2016 with Dr. Dama Balon, and then one that is part of an edited volume from Columbia last year that you could actually access online for free if you look up Preservation and Social Inclusion and Columbia University. And really, how did it provide these counter narratives and stories? And actually having this published was key to, how do we even start to kind of break from diversity and inclusion kind of approaches to more justice and equity. And so for API HIP, I really feel like this has been a moment for us to really do some change. Again, shifting from D&I to justice and equity. When we talk about systems change, we can, in the past, we have thought about, just increasing the number of on the listings on the National Register and NHLs. That is very important, but we also then started to even widen that thinking and think about how do we leverage power of the grassroots and advocate for more diverse, inclusive, and relevant historic preservation policies and practices, not just for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, but throughout. And then we also thought about organizational change, including, initially, let's invite folks to come, to events like Pass Forward, even for our own organization. But then we started to even broaden that again and think about how do we address capacity building, funding, and leadership needs that lessen the barriers to representation through education and engagement. And then the third prong is going from individual support, inviting, API individuals to an existing table in preservation, to expanding that to thinking about more so, how do you create support networks to foster leadership development through education and awareness? And so some of the examples that I cover in my research is through, first, in education. One major part is our Asian and Pacific Islander National Historic Preservation Forum that we hold every 2 years that Anthony had mentioned in the previous session. She was there at the first one in 2010 in San Francisco. We held our most recent one in Honolulu in 2020 before COVID. And so that is one of them. And then another example of awareness and engagement is our online crowdsourcing map called East at Main Street that's hosted by History Pin. And then lastly, our other prong is advocacy. And here I will go deeper into this, but how do we create advocacy through solidarity work and doing federal advocacy? So as I mentioned, the forum, and Anthea had mentioned she went to the very first one in 2010. It was held in San Francisco, and our most recent one was in Honolulu. But the impetus actually for this forum by the founders of API HIP, Bill Watanabe, Michael Macchio, and Joe Kinata, were three of the major brains behind the idea of they were actually at a National Trust conference back in 2007 in Nashville, and Free can verify that because he was there and saw the magic happen, where Bill, Mike, and Joe and, I don't know how, maybe two other Asian and Pacific Islanders were in a swarm of preservationists and didn't see anyone else that looked like them. And they thought, we need to get together. We know we exist, but there is no platform for us to do so. And so that birthed this ad hoc committee that created the first convening in San Francisco. Since then, we've evolved. We went from an ad hoc committee of a planning committee all the way to now we got our nonprofit incorporation back in 2018. Intentionally, we didn't want to jump into becoming a nonprofit right away because we have issues like lack of funding. No one pays for, there's barely any foundations that will support, just the bare bones of a nonprofit, particularly in preservation. So we are, I'm still a non-paid staff member, and everyone is volunteer, and our board actually is a board of people who are on the ground. They're not from foundations, they're not from major corporations, they are actually preservationists from throughout the country. And then our second element that we look at is East at Main Street, which is a way for us to increase awareness and engagement through this online crowdsourcing website, where folks can actually pin photos, videos, audio, and archival documents onto a website that's associated with a location, and help us try to find places that may not be recognized yet or need further support. As well as in complement with the online platform, before COVID, we were going in person throughout the country and doing community workshops. And, for us, it was really like not only gathering the information and for folks to start to see more and more about places that matter throughout the nation, but it was also a tool to inform, and we still use it to inform preservation agencies from, let's say the city of LA or the state of California to the National Park Service when they ask us, oh, we have some funding to maybe, work on a nomination. Do you have anything? This is a tool that we can actually pull an address and say, hey, there are some places, there are partners who have resources that are willing to share and contribute to the process. And then another element is that we've been able to fund summer internships to help build out further this crowdsourcing website. And then the third arm for API HIP is through our work in action, preservation in action, and looking at advocacy, where oftentimes, and this is a photo, or this is a letter from 2018, where we basically went to the Hill, and with this letter, in partnership with Latinos and Heritage Conservation, the Japanese American Citizens League, GLBT Historical Society, Rainbow Heritage, and I'm forgetting the acronym for CNHA, but it's Native Hawaiians. But for those, we signed on, and we had many individuals sign on to support. This was to advocate for the Historic Preservation Fund, particularly the Underrepresented Communities Grant, all of this federal funding that was being at risk, particularly in this last administration, during the Trump administration, to be zeroed out every year in the budget. And so this was a moment where literally no one had the funds to come to Washington, D.C. API HIP, our board members raised some money to help support me to come to D.C. to actually go door to door to every office to fight to save the Historic Preservation Fund, which is ironic because the Underrepresented Communities Grant, it's authorized at $3 million annually and only gets approved for the first few years at 500,000. I think at last it was at 750,000. And that is for all underrepresented groups. So if you can imagine that we get very little funding, but it's still very important for us to advocate. And so that was a moment for us to really step up onto the federal level, on the national level, to be this very small organization, non-paid staff, right? We're not in DC, or not until I moved here, but not having a presence and really feeling like we weren't invited to the table when these critical policies and fundings opportunities were being considered. And also, you know, for us to be present during these heritage initiatives during the Obama administration, constantly making sure we visit the Hill every year during appropriations, and also to support local and state projects and funding. And then also our advocacy work is for doing even letters of support for threatened sites and sites that are being nominated, may be Kalabagay Way in Berkeley, California, which I was able to provide comment there for. And for us to have a voice and for me to call in to Berkeley's council members and say, hello from Washington, DC, you know, is something that like, it has that impact. And you know, we may be these really small organizations, but to have such lasting impact, to make these kind of you know, support for local efforts. And you know, it makes me also think about and this is what I'm gonna end with, you know, first we came from going to, you know, just meeting in a small room at the National Trust in 2007 to last year I was invited to speak with Charles Lee from the EPA and Ria Suh, who she was president of the Natural Resources Defense Council, where we celebrated Asian Pacific American Heritage Month last or May 2019. By invitation by Chairman Grijalva, and you see next to him on his right, Congressman TJ Cox, Filipino American from elected official from California, and Congresswoman Deb Haaland. It was an honor to speak to them and to tell them about the importance, and to, you know, for me to say from, you know, my board members, from Bill, from Joe and Mike, to feel like we just need to get together and see each other to progress in within 10 years, to be in the Capitol building providing remarks has been an honor. And so this is how we frame, and I look at, you know, Asians and Pacific Islanders shifting the narrative from diversity and inclusion to justice and equity. So thank you.
Sorry, I'm having some trouble making this stay open. I'm really sorry. I don't know why it's not. Is it okay like that? Can you see it?
We can see your slides. It's not on presenter view, but we can see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sarah, you can slide that, the menu bar with like 1, 2, 3, 4 over so it's smaller, and it'll make your screen you want us to see bigger. So it won't be presentation view still, but.
Gotcha. Okay, I apologize about that. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate. I'm going to talk about the origins of Latinos in heritage conservation and make a call for a solidarity movement to dismantle white supremacy in historic preservation. I'm not a historic preservation professional. I am a museum worker who found myself involved in historic preservation work close to 10 years ago when I joined the West Side Preservation Alliance, a grassroots historic preservation group in San Antonio, which I believe you'll hear more about this afternoon in Dr. Antonia Castañeda's talk. Much of my museum career has been about abolishing gatekeepers and making history more accessible and meaningful to the general public, and my historic preservation work has followed that model. I believe that for historic preservation to remain relevant in the 21st century, it must be part of both a movement to eliminate gatekeepers and to disentangle itself from the white supremacist ideology that too often devalues historic sites connected to our country's racially and ethnically diverse past, present, and future. So a little bit about the origins of LHC. In 2013, I met Desiree Aranda at the National Association of Latino Arts and Culture Leadership Institute. At that time, she worked at San Francisco Heritage, and she introduced me to Laura Dominguez, who was working at the Los Angeles Conservancy and who will be speaking at the conference tomorrow. We knew that the preservation movement is largely local, especially in communities of color, and that community groups and individuals have been hard at work on Latino preservation issues in cities and towns across the United States for many years. But it was hard to know just what was happening in other places and how to connect to others doing similar work. We decided that a national network would serve as a platform for raising the visibility of heritage conservation in Latino communities and help empower individuals to take direct action to protect and sustain historic places within their communities. We also felt that this would enable the creation of a collective voice on preservation issues affecting Latino communities and allow us to share our struggles, our victories, and our lessons learned with others. So we officially started in 2014. And I also just want to say that we were especially inspired by API HIP, which was several years old at that point. And we continue to be inspired by them and especially appreciative of Michelle's friendship and mentorship as we've grown. I will keep coming back to this point, but I want to underscore the importance of solidarity movements. This is the only way we will dismantle white supremacy and historic preservation and in all areas of our lives. A year after we launched via a series of video calls and sharing our lists of contacts, we convened our first national gathering in Tucson, where we sketched out a structure and initial priorities. What we came up with is that LHC is a national advocacy network. We're working to increase Latino representation in historic preservation, but we're also an agent of social change. We are committed to moving beyond language of diversity and inclusion and really putting equity and social justice at the center of our work. Early on, we came to understand that our organization was a social justice intervention into historic preservation. We know that the field of historic preservation is not neutral, that there are major blind spots in the field, and our registered landmarks don't reflect our nation's diversity. In particular, we are up against an all too frequent unequal application of preservation policies and practices that results in unequal representation in the historic landscape. This is a legacy of white supremacy. We are committed to the concept of preservation justice. We're calling for a reframing of historic preservation policies and practices to integrate a social change narrative grounded in equity. We not only want to increase we want an increase in recognized and designated Latino historic sites. We would also like an increase in Latinos working in the field. We want to locate preservation justice among other social justice movements committed to dismantling white supremacy. These include areas of education, housing, the environment, and criminal justice reform. This is, importantly, a multi-issue solidarity movement, and alliances are going to be critical to its success. We also just want to never forget that our communities have been doing this work for a very long time. Colonialism and white supremacy, often presented under the guise of progress and capitalism, have operated to push our communities out. Displacement and gentrification aren't new, and they're a common theme in my presentation as I wrap up. Oftentimes, our work to preserve our historic sites and our historic communities have occurred outside of the view of mainstream preservationists. And yet our communities have been doing that work. They've been saving homes, they've been saving neighborhoods, and they've been saving businesses that tell their stories. They've also been resisting those forces that don't see the value in our historic places. We would really like to encourage a greater consciousness of the modern preservation movement's origins in the 1960s, in the context of the civil rights movement, in the context of the early stages of the environmental movement, and in the context of other efforts to ensure greater social and cultural equity. Today, we face many of the same problems of earlier times, one of which is that too often our preservation work is described with the dismissive and racially loaded term activism. I once gave a job talk at a university where I presented on my preservation work, and one of the committee members said, "So this is just activism." You know, the use of the word activism in place of words like advocacy or expert labor, without even acknowledging the research or the community knowledge behind this work, is something that we are trying to expose and remake. Heritage conservation, as we know, is all about belonging. And the built environment locates us in our nation's history. Our historic sites are elements of who we are. So just to talk a little bit about the work that LHC has done, we hold biennial national gatherings. I showed you the one in Tucson. We've had 3 to date with another one planned for this September in Denver. Hopefully we'll be able to be in person. We have an electronic newsletter, La Valencia. We write advocacy letters like the one Michelle shared. We participate in national trust panels. We participate in public talks like this one. And we are relatively active on Facebook and Instagram, trying to raise awareness of Latino historic sites. After 6 years as a collective, in 2020, we incorporated as an all-volunteer nonprofit 501c3. I also just want to highlight the work of some of my colleagues, some of whom you'll get to hear from in this conference. Several of our board members have played a role in garnering national recognition for Latino historic sites, including in January 2017 when we got we got 4 related Latino-related national historic landmarks designations, 2 of which were worked on by LHC board members at that time, Josie Talamantes, who worked on the Chicano Park designation, and Ray Rast, who worked on the Our Lady of Guadalupe Mission Chapel, who I think we'll be talking about that later this afternoon. We also have 2 National Trust National Treasures now, thanks to the work of Sela Mota Casper. Even as we celebrated these wins, I just want to say that we have never had to stop confronting the ugly face of white supremacy. Just a few months, for example, after the Chicano Park National Historic Landmark designation, white nationalists descended upon the park twice to protest there in a space that was of importance to the Latino community. I also just want to wrap up with a few examples about why, even though we are a national group and we're calling for a national movement, we never want to underscore the importance of the grassroots. Grassroots stories, local stories are part of the national narrative. I know that later today, you'll hear from Antonia Castañeda about what happened at Univision, but this was the nation's first full-time Spanish language television station. Absolutely a national story, but here locally, it was seen as a piece of land next to the river that was worth a lot of money, and so this was torn down to build luxury apartments. What happened at Univision is what I describe as capitalism and white supremacy colluding to devalue our historic sites. This is another example. This is the Malt House. This was a historic site here in San Antonio that was demolished to build a 7-Eleven convenience store, just a stone's throw from the diabetes center in the neighborhood. This is a community with sky-high rates of diabetes, high blood pressure, and obesity. And this community only has 1 full-service grocery store. And this is what happened. In another example, this was the Valencia grocery store, the former Valencia grocery store, which was founded by Antonio Valencia. Mr. Valencia was an important figure in confronting segregation in San Antonio. In the face of segregation, he used his store and the money that he was able to build from that store to fund sports teams and social clubs for Mexican Americans, including the famous Patio Andaluz, which was an incubator for the West Side Sound that gave us hits like 96 Tears. The city decided to put the jail in across the street from this building, and with time, with the jail right there, the area declined. And so then the city declined to designate this building historic, and it was demolished. Currently, we are trying to save the Alazan Apache courts, the oldest and largest extant public housing complex in San Antonio, which was built to serve the Mexican American community of the West Side, opened between 40 and 41. It continues to house 1,200 people, almost all of whom are Mexican American and over half of whom are under the age of 18. The trust put this on their list of the 11 most endangered historic sites just last year. It's still up for demolition here in town. I just want to close with saying that we really need to challenge paradigms around whose past is worth saving, whose stuff is worth saving. We need to confront the way that white supremacy is devaluing the things that are meaningful to people of color, and especially working class people of color. We need to think about how we counter that specter of colonialism that sees our communities as kind of tourist attractions instead of as living, breathing, active, contributing communities to the US. We need to mentor more people, get them in the field. We need more people of color on preservation boards, and we need more allies. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I hope I can be heard well. So I am Jeffrey Harris, better known in the preservation world by my nickname of Free. I'm a Hampton, Virginia-based historian and historic preservation consultant. And for the purpose of today's meeting, I'm going to showcase the fact that I am the board chair of the Rainbow Heritage Network, which is a national network that has a nonprofit that is dedicated to the work of helping to preserve the nation's LGBTQ historic places. And we also make it a point to work with facilitating networking among preservation professionals who are a part of the LGBTQ community. We do advocacy work for our LGBTQ historic places. We also want to make sure that we facilitate conversations in, during opportunities like we have here. And we also want to provide resources for those who are working to preserve LGBTQ historic places across the country. What I am doing here is a little different from what my predecessors have done. And I decided to keep my historian hat on and just give a quick little sense of what I was going to talk. My intention was to talk about the challenges and the rewards of chairing the Rainbow Heritage Network. So a little fun and a little tea and truth and all of that good stuff. But what I really wanted to begin with, I wanted to start off on the good and talk about the rewards. One reward is it's being part of a necessary effort to diversify the preservation enterprise from an LGBTQ context. One of the things that was particularly interesting in my mind is the number of LGBTQ individuals who actually work within the realm of historic preservation. So unlike other minority groups, there was actually a relatively easy sense that we could pull from people who are already doing this work. But the idea was now to begin the process of turning all of our attention to the actual historic resources for our communities. And that had not really been being done in earnest until, within the last, say, 15 years to a degree. And now we're really seeing the momentum of that, coming through building. And what we need to do now is to not only move, sooner using our places, our placements across the country already in existing preservation organizations, We need to move in the direction of preserving places that we know of, but we're also doing some really good work of reviewing places that already have been designated, already have been listed, and looking back to see lost or closeted, if you will, LGBTQ stories within existing places. And it's been interesting, to say the least, to find places that people don't necessarily think of that have an LGBTQ tie. So for example, there's a lovely home on the campus of Virginia State University in HBCU in Ettrick, Virginia, that was designed by a self-taught African-American woman, Amazali Meredith. And her home was recognized because she was a self-taught architect who created a beautiful home in the international style, sort of a post-World War I, architectural style. Interestingly, though, it turns out that she had a partner, and her partner happened to be a colleague of hers at Virginia State University, Dr. Edna Mead Colson. And that home was left when Meredith passed away. The home was left to Colson, as well as to Virginia State University. So essentially she had a life estate. And it was interesting because the nomination was rewritten to bring forth that fact that these women were partners. And what it has given the opportunity, if one wants to go into it, is that they couldn't have been alone. We know that the LGBTQ community doesn't roll quietly and by itself. There is an underground network. And the idea now would be to look more broadly, say, at the Virginia State University community from the early 20th century to see who these women were, who were they in community with. So that's the sort of work that the Rainbow Heritage Network really wants to get more of our colleagues to really look at doing, and really trying to get them, sort of refocused on things that we already know how to do, but turning our attention on those stories that have been hidden or closeted. The other aspect that we want to focus on are those places that we know are endangered, historic places that we know are there, but have not been landmarked as they should. So what we're finding is that in places all across the country, we're discovering, again, because we're lucky in that we have LGBTQ folks already within the movement and already working as professionals, they're using our network that we created, our social network through the Rainbow Heritage Network, say primarily through our Facebook group, to alert the rest of us, the rest of the community out there, that there are historic places that are in need of, saving, landmarking. How can we help? And, we've had some really good luck and successes with that effort. Of course, we can't save everything. Every site is not going to be preserved, which is, honestly, it's the case. We know that this is the case, but those things that we can save and those things that we can preserve, it's necessary to do. So that's one part, being a part of a necessary effort to diversify the preservation enterprise from an LGBTQ context. Another reward is discovering the variety of projects, as I just mentioned, through social media. I spend half of my time, reading things online and just being amazed at what people are finding, these hidden stories that we didn't know, but also being very, very pleased that the preservation community, broadly speaking, has decided that, with regard to our status as, as a minority group, has been willing to really come to our aid to preserve LGBTQ historic places. There will always be pushback, but you don't see much of it, again, because of how we're placed within the movement, within the preservation enterprise. We already know what to do. We know some of the tricks of the trade. We know how to avoid some of the potholes, if you will, towards success. So that's helpful. Another is interacting with people interested in this work. So one of the things that Rainbow Heritage does, we will receive random messages via email with people who have a historic site that they are interested in finding more information about, or they're young students who are, or not so young, students who are interested in a preservation project based on an LGBTQ historic place. And we're able to, make those connections as they need. I literally yesterday answered an email request from a graduate student who is looking to have a project on landmarking a LGBTQ historic place, if there is one that could be found in Chicago. Now, I personally am not aware of that, but I made the point of recommending to the student that, not only will I forward the information to whomever I could, but I encouraged her to join the Facebook group and to look to LGBTQ organizations in the Chicagoland area. And, to be able to be in that position, and I signed it off letting her know that she actually caught the chair of the organization on top of that. And, and it's a nice feeling to be able to relay. I know how I would have felt if I were on her side and the response to my random email would have come from the chair of an organization that does this sort of work. What of course she didn't know is I was also Black, which is a whole other, discussion in terms of being an African-American, out African-American who's chair of an LGBTQ preservation organization, but that's a separate story. So interacting with people who have this interest in preserving LGBTQ sites is a wonderful opportunity. It is great because we get the opportunity to really use our skills, whether we're archaeologists, historians, preservation professionals, or just, men and women who have been in the trenches dealing with LGBTQ work and finally saying, we need the recognition for the work that we've done. That is a great thing. Moving on to the little, tougher things in terms of the challenges of, again, being chair of this type of organization. One is it's having the ability to set aside the time required to do the work. This is an all volunteer, as many organizations are, an all volunteer nonprofit. Every single person that is on our board has a full-time job doing something else. There is no paid staff person. Everybody is having to do what they can to, keep themselves alive, especially in the age of COVID. And, there are times when RHN sadly will have to be moved to the back burner, which I think everyone in this day and age can understand. That is, it just is something that has to be done. But what we don't want is to find ourselves like we have on occasion, which is having to play catch up again, because we've all had to put things on that back burner and reintroduce ourselves as an organization to the broader preservation enterprise. So that is definitely a challenge. Also, one of the things that we as an organization have had is really trying to define specific parameters of what it is that we should and can do. We cannot do everything, as much as I think many of us would love to be able to do, but we can't do everything. And it has been a challenge for the organization to really lay down exactly what it is that we want to do. We recognize that we have the riches of people who are already peppered within the preservation enterprise, as I've said, but it's a matter of determining how we want to best use the riches that we have as a board, as an organization, to really help move forward this idea of preserving LGBTQ historic places. And the beauty, again, of that is that we hit every community. Every community has LGBTQ folks in it. So we're a natural ally and work across the board. And one of the things that I'm particularly proud of that we do is that when we're asked by peer organizations to sign on to something, to advocate on their behalf, we absolutely will do it. I got to work on, signing that letter to help, preserve that aspect of Angel Island so that it's not isolated at this point. The Angel Island Immigration Center in in San Francisco County, those sorts of things, because we want to make it clear to our partners and our allies that we're here. That we're here for them. And when we need it, we will hope that they will be there for us. And again, because we have the unique position of having people who are represented in every single group that exists. Another sort of the last challenge that I'll say is, it's the idea of, and all of us who are tied to nonprofits, it's the idea of keeping our board engaged and recognizing, what our strengths and weaknesses are. The process of doing preservation work on a voluntary basis and trying to save places, that will really put you to the test in terms of what you can do, what you can't do, who you can rely on, who you cannot rely on. So we're all going through these sorts of things, in terms of doing this particular work. So again, I didn't, so I apologize if anyone was looking for images and things like that. But what I really wanted to do was to really focus on what these challenges can be and to try to be as realistic as I can be with you all who are in the audience. But I also really want to emphasize that the rewards outweigh the challenges. They absolutely do. This work is important. It is necessary. I absolutely agree that we have to tackle the issues of white supremacy. We have to tackle the issues of privileges that are there, and we have to be prepared to have our colleagues who are in positions of privilege work with us, use the privileges that they possess to help us advance things, but also make sure that we have our seats at the table, make sure that we have our voices fully heard and understood clearly, loudly, firmly, so that we are all moving things forward, because this is all good work. What we're all doing is really good work. And our country and our peers around, they need to know the information that we have. They need to know these historic places. Again, I'm an historian. So I'm all about making sure that if you know the history, you're better off for it. If it's given to you in the best way that we can, and we know that people visiting historic sites really take in their understanding of history that much more, it resonates that much more clearly, then that's great. We're already in that work. We do that work. We're the ones who get to see people who are moved when they're at an historic site and they're really taking in the fact that this thing that they're really interested in happened where they're standing, that the person that they admire the most, they engage the same space. I want, everybody who is involved in this work to understand that the Rainbow Heritage Network is trying to do that same work and evoke those same feelings for those who are in the LGBTQ community. That's what we do. That's what we're hoping to still do. Again, still have those challenges. We're not perfect. Lord knows I haven't been the perfect chair. I can admit that. But, at least we're still moving forward. We're trying to move forward in this new year. We're 6 years old this year. So it's a nice thing to know. So with that, I am going to turn things back over to our moderator, and hopefully we have enough time. I've left enough time for decent Q&A. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Jeffrey, and thank you, Sarah, Jeffrey, and Michelle, for 3 very compelling presentations. We only have a few minutes, maybe a couple of minutes for questions, and we are monitoring the Q&A box and the Google Doc. But just real quick, some of the common themes I felt emerged from your presentations are that, we need to shift and reclaim the narratives for some of these sites. We need to look at lost stories related to existing sites and their interpretation. We have to figure out how we long-term impact the field of historic preservation. And I think Sarah used the term disentangle it from the mentality of white supremacy and colonialism that unfortunately permeates it at this time. And then some of the other issues that were brought up were that we need to work on solidarity movements, work with natural allies, address the lack of resources and capacity to do this work in our communities, and really empower the grassroots. So those were just some of the themes that I gleaned from your presentations. So in line though with the previous panel, I wanted to just pose a question in the little time that we have left to all 3 of you, and that's that in that context, in the particularly what I laid out in relation to the solidarity movements and lack of resources and what we need to try to address. What opportunities do you see, with the changes in Washington, D.C. and its administration, but also in the context of, continued white supremacist, entrenchment and, if anything, growth and development in this country. So any thoughts you have around those challenges and those opportunities are appreciated.
Well, I have to say real quick, when things arise, like in the last year, after the murder of George Floyd and all these attempts to address racism, white supremacy, how to be an anti-racist. One thing that I know we've done in our circles, we have a circle. We call our circle to support each other and be like, checking in, how are you doing? Are you being asked to do these task force for free too? And that's our solid. I know for those of us who sit in these spaces, like we check in when a task force we're invited, this honorific ask to sit on a task force for free. And we all say in solidarity, no, we're not gonna sit in a diversity task force for free. And then they pass it on to someone else and they don't realize that we all talk to each other and that we are working, we are born from the civil rights movement. We have read the books of our elders who have worked in this movement for many generations and listened to their stories. And so, it's being replicated still of like, they think we don't know each other or talk to each other. And I think that's what solidarity work looks like. And to the point of in this next administration, we're in talks with each other of like, how can we support political appointments at the interior? How can we support, senior level positions, not only in the interior, but anything related to historic preservation on the federal level? People write letters of support individually, organizationally, for these packets, for the Biden administration to consider. We, support, Congresswoman Deb Haaland in her nomination as the Secretary of the Interior. So really like, solidarity work is from the most macro level, from like Sarah texting me, please get some sleep tonight, to like texting me like, let's figure this out with Congress, with Interior Secretary Haaland, right? And so like, how do we do that kind of solidarity work and to sustain ourselves and each other? And I wanted to do real quick, I know I'm taking up time, but I want to do one quick share screen because we were all talking about the years our organizations were born. And we actually have a new friend to say hello to. And that is Black in Historic Preservation. They just started today. And I am just completely moved because that is something we've been asking for every year at the National Trust Conference. We know that the Action Fund exists within the trust, but we don't have a grassroots, community-driven Black, organization like ours. And so I woke up this morning to this Instagram post and I just like, I think that speaks volumes, right? Like we riff off of each other, we inspire each other, and that we're small, we're a volunteer, but we're mighty. And so it's just like, I can't wait for what we can all do together moving forward.
I would just maybe like to add one little thing to what Michelle said, and that's in this new administration. I really do hope for all the best things for the National Park Service. I think those last 4 years were so scary for those of us who love the National Park Service. But also I know that with this pandemic and the way that this pandemic has hit communities of color in particular, we have an already really a housing crisis that is now just amplified, and this is a real state of emergency for so many people. And I really want to see historic preservation doing a better job at working to preserve affordable housing. And I'm not just, I mean, yes, I'm thinking about the Alazan Apache courts, but I'm thinking about affordable housing across the country and the way that historic preservation and perhaps historic tax credits can be leveraged to create a movement to save affordable housing across the country.
And adding to that, I would go even further in saying that, with everything that's been said before, but there's also the idea of building on small businesses, main streets, getting it to the point where people who can provide jobs that can't be outsourced can do that within, again, the same sets of communities. And we've heard these talks for decades. Make it happen. People know how to do these things, and there are people placed who can do it. Just let them be able to do that. That's one of the hopes that I would have, that the full force of the preservation enterprise could really come to pass with the idea of building back better, I believe is the slogan. So that would be what I would hope to see with the Biden administration.
Well, regrettably, we've come to the end of our time. I know we can go on for much longer. If you had questions or comments in the Q&A box or on the Google Doc that we didn't get to, they have been recorded, and hopefully someone can respond to you at a later time. But thank you all for joining this amazing panel, and have a great rest of the afternoon.